this.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your 4-star, limited time only host, Madelyn.
I'm your common 2-star, really again, host, Emma.
And thanks for tuning into the show. This week, it's a side quest, and it's Emma's pick. So, Emma, reach into the great bucket of side quest topics and tell me what you've randomly selected for today's topic.
Heck yeah. This week, we're talking about Gacha. Everybody cheered. I can hear it. I can hear all you listeners. You're like, yeah. Heck yeah. We're talking about Gacha. Probably very surface level talking about Gacha, considering that this is like an hour-long podcast, but that's what we're talking about, so.
We're talking about as much as we can talk about in an hour.
Yep.
So, Emma, I'll ask you, as I always do, what made you choose this week's topic? What
nothing in
pulled
particular.
you to Gacha?
Well, nothing really. I don't know. Well, part of it is because I'm pretty regularly playing a gacha game now, with Near Reincarnation. So I thought if there's any time to talk about gacha, it would be during a time that I'm actually playing a gacha game, you know, can bring my personal experience to the table.
Nice.
And the other one was, like, a couple of weeks ago now, Genshin had its, like, anniversary event that people were like so mad about that they like review bombed it down to 2 stars on like the Apple App Store or whatever. I don't really know what that was about, and honestly I didn't really look into it, but that was part of the reason why I was thinking about it. I believe it was just because they didn't do anything particularly big, not because of like predatory gacha practices.
Hasn't Genshin done enough?
Yeah.
To be honest, how much more can you reasonably expect from them?
Yeah.
So Emma's addicted to gacha now. That's what she's saying.
No. And let's not joke, okay?
I'm sorry. You're right. That was the one time I was going to do that. I won't joke about it. We're going to talk about this seriously this episode. But I just want to say that I was concerned about Emma when we went to Japan, and she could not stop herself from playing physical gacha. I was like, Emma, it's a good thing you don't play any virtual games. And she was like, ha ha ha, I would never. Like, that would never interest me in the same way. And now here she is.
To be fair, I did not, on the gashapon machines in Japan, I didn't really like stay on one and keep pulling from it. It was like, I'll get one from here, and one from here. Which, I think the former is more a problem than the latter.
Fair enough. Although, the latter did lead to me having that horrible Rainbow Bright girl from The World Ends With You as my pull.
As evidenced by our notes, which I attempted to go back and correct a minute ago, but I still see a few in here. I don't even know how to spell gacha, so how could I be, troubled by it?
Well, Emma,
keep putting a T in there that doesn't exist.
We are going to talk plenty about children who no doubt cannot spell gacha and the dangers to them, I'm sure.
That's fair.
So, not the best argument you've ever made, I'll admit.
That's fair. Well, gacha is a kind of a genre of video game in a lot of ways, or at least a subgenre, and certainly a common mechanic in a lot of mobile games especially, but as we'll talk about, they're pretty much the same thing as loot boxes, and that's pretty present in console games as well. So it's not just limited to mobile games, but you'll find it a lot there. And as Malin mentioned, the term is taken from the gashapon or gashapon machines that are pretty prevalent in Japan, where you put in like 100 yen coin or something, and turn it, and then you get a little capsule toy out, like a gumball machine, but like a little charm or a pin or something. And that's because it's onomatopoeia. The crank is Gacha, and then when it lands, it's pon. And I thought that was funny, so I was like, yeah, that is what it sounds like.
I didn't know that before researching for this podcast, but I was like, oh, that does make a lot of sense. I really thought it had something to do with the word gotcha.
Yeah,
like,
me too.
Heck yeah. I gotcha now.
That's just a happy accident, I guess.
It worked out. Sounds like what it means, both in terms of sound and in terms of meaning. So, yes. Nice.
And it's the Japanese term for it, I think, basically. So it makes sense that a lot of things I read were like, well, it started in Japan. But I believe at like the same time as this was becoming popular in games in Japan, we were starting to see over in the West things that developers called loot boxes, which are basically the same concept. And basically what this is you're paying money or paying a premium currency, basically, which, you know, you either directly pay your own money or you use your own money to buy fake money in the game that the fake money can then buy items. But instead of like directly purchasing something like you might with like DLC, where there's cosmetics DLC, you're like, I like these outfits, I will pay, you know, $2 to specifically get these outfits. And I know that's
like
what I'll
Sora.
get.
I will pay.
Yes. Yeah.
I
want Sora in Super Smash Bros. I'll pay like $8.99 and I will get Sora. I won't get a random fighter from the fighter pass, for example. Because what gacha and loot boxes are is basically you're paying a set price for a certain amount of item pulls, and you get a random assortment of items, and the better ones have less chance of being pulled by you, basically, is how it works. So rather than paying for a specific item, you're paying for the chance to get any number of items.
And I was trying to read some articles to see if I could find any distinction between loot box and gacha, except that gacha is typically applied to Eastern games and loot box to Western games. I was somewhat convinced by the idea that loot boxes are often more, like, less character-based, but that felt like if that's the biggest distinction I'm going to be able to draw, that gacha is often playable characters and loot boxes is typically not. Yeah, it really is just different names for 99% the same thing.
Yeah, that's also the distinction that I found in my research is coming up the most often. But that might just have to do with, like, where, like, developers making certain games in certain countries due to trends, you know?
Absolutely.
Rather than, like, them actually being official definitions for distinguishing those things.
Absolutely. So they're the same. I really feel like we have talked about loot boxes on the show before, but again, as usual, I can't remember if it was a side quest or if it was just we were talking about a game that had loot boxes in it.
We've definitely talked about them before. It certainly wasn't on this style of podcast of side quest, I believe. We probably talked about it. I know we've talked about Overwatch. That would be my guess. And maybe as like a topic on one of our news magazine ones.
And, you know, these things are only becoming more and more common in games, although, as we'll talk about, they're also becoming subject, in some ways at least, to more and more regulation, both from inside and outside the industry, although predominantly from inside.
Yes. I was looking into, like, laws that countries have against gacha or loot boxes, and there's really not many of them. Like, there's a 2020 Screen Rant summary where Japan has some laws about it. Specifically, they've outlawed complete gacha, or I think it's compa gacha is the thing, which is basically like where you have to pull a certain amount of things before you can get, like, a rare reward or, like, make progress in the game. It's basically like a system where the gacha, like, no arguments blocks your progress in progressing.
Well, or it makes something impossible to get without having 100% of the gacha.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. China, of course, has laws about loot boxes because they have laws about everything.
China is one of the, I mean, I don't mean to frame this in a positive or a negative light, but I do feel like China is one of the only countries that actually has laws pertaining to video games.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Even, we'll talk a little bit about some of these Japanese laws, I think, but even there, there's a lot of industry self-regulation, and of course in the US that's very much the case as well, as much as Congress occasionally likes to shake their fists and threaten things.
Yeah. But China's main things are that loot boxes have to disclose all drop rates and all rewards that you could possibly get, and that there's also only a certain amount that can be bought by a player per day. The Netherlands has one against loot boxes where the prize has market value. So, like, they can be sold outside the game, basically. This is sort of vague because I feel like that could theoretically apply to any game where you can have, like, special things. There's a whole market for, like, buying and selling accounts that have certain characters on them, for instance. So that one seems a little bit vague. And then Belgium just says loot boxes.
No.
Which led to the games released in Belgium either altering their games so loot boxes aren't there, or Nintendo just totally pulled their mobile games from that market.
It's interesting to me to talk about that. Well, to talk both about those Chinese and Dutch laws, right? Because the Chinese law that everything has to be disclosed is something now that I think both Western loot box developers and the Japanese, it's the JAGSA, but it's basically this conglomerate of big gacha game developers, have imposed as not voluntary, right? Because anyone on their storefronts has to do it, or you have to do it for the ESRB and disclose that sort of thing now. But they're doing it without requirement from the government to do that. They've imposed this self-regulation. So it's interesting that, like, in China, no, they have actually made that the law, and everywhere else game companies have been like, whoa, don't make any laws, like, we'll take care of this, chill. Which is interesting, right? Because of course, I mean, perhaps for slightly different reasons. I won't pretend to be an expert in Japanese politics, right? But in both places, there's the worry that the government might go further than banning the most predatory of gacha and instead ban all degrees of predatory gacha, which is, of course, all of it to some degree or another.
Yeah. I definitely read a little bit about when Japan put the ban on complete gacha in effect. There was a bunch of big companies that saw a very steep stock drop immediately.
Yeah, these big companies lost billions of dollars in a day. And then somebody in the Japanese government came out and said, yeah, these things are kind of predatory. And then they lost like another $1 billion in another day. So it was a huge impact. And, you can think about not just in terms of stock price, but the revenue impact of that, right? If your game is designed around people pulling gacha so that they can get all of the ones in the pack and then get the super bonus one, of course, without that incentive, you lose a lot of revenue. And it's that incentive that it seemed like was at the heart of why the complete gacha was banned as opposed to just gacha in general. Emma, you posted a truly really comprehensive guide to gacha law in Japan in particular. I was like, who wrote all of this? So detailed. I was very impressed. And in some ways it did seem geared toward mobile developers, of like, if you're developing a mobile game for Japan, here's what you need to know. And so the reason that they banned complete gacha is because complete gacha serves as like an incentive to keep gambling.
Yeah.
Basically. Like the idea being that there's something, like, because there's something at stake beyond just the thing that you're pulling, that is incentivizing you to keep buying in. And Japan has very strict gambling laws, except for pachinko, basically, and horse racing. As opposed to in the US, where there are gambling laws, but at least within a state and in person, like casinos are much more of a thing. Betting in general is much more of a thing. In Japan, there are like 3 casinos that are allowed, and they have only been allowed for the past 3 years.
Oh, so that's why all the Yakuza games have secret underground casinos.
That's literally what I thought as I was playing. I was like, oh, that makes sense now why they're like, oh my god, I can go in here and like play darts. Who would have thought? I get it now. But they didn't ban normal gacha because normal gacha is like, okay, you just get the thing. Like it doesn't in theory incentivize you to keep going because you do get a thing every time.
Yeah.
However, and something that I always have a really bad reaction to the crackdowns from companies on gacha being about, they're like, no, like there can't be a secondary market for it. On the one hand, I always have the reaction of, okay, like I understand the positive of what you're doing here in that the secondary market involves people spending a lot of money to buy rare characters. However, I know the reason you are doing this is 1, you want them to spend that money to try to pull the rare characters in your game.
Mm-hmm.
And 2, because apparently in Japan, it seems like it's kind of important to maintaining that gacha itself is not gambling. Because if you have a secondary market for those characters or whatever prizes, they become things of value. And if you're winning things of value, you're much closer to falling into a gambling situation than if you're saying, oh, no, like, it's not worth anything except in the game.
Yeah.
Which is interesting to me that, like, that's the Dutch law, basically. Because if you just crack down on the secondary market, would you be able to say they aren't worth anything and then bring it back? Unclear.
Unfortunately, internet clout does not count as worth something, I guess.
How do I value internet clout?
I definitely think, and I did not look into this enough to like make an informed theory about it, but in terms of like gacha versus gambling, there's definitely the sense of like government agencies still don't fully understand the internet. And I think that because gacha is, like, next to the internet in terms of, like, why things are valued or, like, what's going on with it, that they don't know how to deal with that either.
That is the sense that I get, too. Especially, again, I won't pretend to have any kind of even but the barest knowledge of Japanese politics, right? But especially in the US, it's like, man, these people don't know what Facebook is. Like, no one is going to be able to explain to Mitch McConnell what Genshin Impact is.
Yeah.
And maybe he is, you know what? I wouldn't actually be surprised if Mitch was very much like, gacha, that's fine. Not predatory at all.
I know the Japanese government knows about Demon Slayer. That's like their media knowledge is every time they want to seem cool, they're like, yeah, I've watched Demon Slayer. Like, okay, Japanese politician, so has literally everybody else in your country.
Yeah. I haven't finished Squid Game yet. I want there to be a gacha Squid Game. Surprise! That's what the show is all about. What is it in Japan? Oya gacha? Is that the thing, right?
I don't know.
Did you read about this? It's apparently a very disrespectful phrase.
I did hear about that, yeah.
That
your parents.
The parent the parent gacha.
I did. I remember reading about that and thinking it was really funny.
Yeah.
The kids are so disrespectful these days.
I know. How do we ban gacha when life is itself gacha?
Truly.
To quote Forrest Gump, life's a roll of Gacha. You never know what you're gonna get.
It is what he said. Chocolate boxes, the original Gacha.
That is what EA says, isn't it?
Oh yeah. EA says, that's not gambling, it's like a Kinder Egg.
And we banned Kinder Eggs because they choke children.
That is a little bit different. Also, this was in a BBC article. I think it's just the US banned Kinder Eggs, right? It wasn't like...
I think so.
Yeah.
That's the relevant knowledge that I have. Still feel like my metaphorical point still stands.
It's also just, like, a bad comparison. Like, you get a Kinder Egg and, like, the child is happy because there's a little insignificant toy in there that they're gonna, like, toss in the trash in, like, a week or something. And there's not... Kinder Egg does not, like, label their toys with, like, rarities.
They should. I think they should be required to.
Yeah. There's not 4-star Kinder Egg toy versus a 2-star Kinder Egg toy.
Look, you say that, you know that there is a thriving, like, Kinder Egg toy market somewhere. Limited edition stuff.
There's certainly the Kinder Egg black market, you know,
yes.
Smuggling them into the US. So maybe the toys are like that too. Who knows?
So, is Gacha bad?
My conclusion from doing all this reading is it's not, like, fundamentally worse on a basic level than anything else that we allow that can cause addiction, right? Like, it just works the same way as regular gambling or drugs or alcohol or whatever, in that, like, it gives you the little happy guys in your brain go, woo, when something good happens. And then if you have, like, an addictive mindset, as you continue to get that, there's less happy guys in your brain. And you keep chasing the more happy guys by continuing to do the behavior, right? So, like, we accept a lot of things in our society that can do that. It's just that there's more regulation around it, or more, like, support areas around it, you know? Like, any drug has, like, whatever anonymous, right? And there's gambling support things, but there's not really, like, a gacha addiction support group. Or if there is certainly not as big as Alcoholics Anonymous, for instance.
Genshin Anonymous doesn't immediately bring up anything, so...
Yeah. So the issue with gacha as opposed to those things right now is just that it's new and nobody, like, it's... people are figuring out what to do with it, basically. The only area where I would say it maybe gets worse than some of those things is the timed events, which is a pretty common feature in gacha games, where there'll be, like, a banner for a certain period of time, like a month or 3 weeks or something, where you can get limited time event characters by pulling from that banner. And if you don't get them during that time, they're gone, you know, for some indeterminate amount of time until they decide to maybe bring them back at some point down the line. And that sort of taps into the FOMO feeling, which is something outside of the regular, like, addiction cycle, which could bring more people into pulling during that limited time. And I think that's the only place where I'm like, that seems like they're digging into a different predatory area than just, like, going to the casino does.
I do wonder if there are equivalent events in casino world or, like, alcohol world. You know what I mean? Like,
I did think of it a little, it's like peer pressure a little bit. In that, like, there's this cool thing happening, but you gotta do it now. You know, it's like the chance to make friends is your limited event banner at a party. You know, and they're like, drink some alcohol and you want to look cool. So you drink the alcohol, for instance. That feels comparable to this sort of thing, but it's not like structured in the same way, you know?
I guess I do have the reaction to it though of like, but like we do limited time events. Like I get it, right? It's gambling, so it's different. But like other games do limited time events with limited time stuff, and we don't necessarily feel like that's predatory. And so it's just this kind of toxic combo, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think limited time events are by themselves bad, but when it's like, well, you can, only get this character by pulling for them within this limited time span. And you're like, and you're at the end, and you can't get enough free gems, and so you buy some so that you can try to get that character at the last minute, for instance.
That makes sense. I do think some of the negative reaction to it, at least some of my negative reaction to Gacha, is that it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, I realize it does, right? And when were we talking about Patrick Klepek, right? Weren't we talking about
last episode? Yeah.
Right, great. So I was reading an article from him where he was talking about, like, okay, like, Genshin Impact didn't really grab him, but he's playing,
the pinball one, yes.
Yeah. And he said, like, oh, okay, I get it now. Like, Gacha doesn't make any sense until you get the Gacha game that's, like, your Gacha game. And then all of a sudden, you get it. Mm-hmm. And I think, like, that's part of why it seems perhaps especially predatory, maybe, to me. Because it just is like, what's the point? Like, it feels like a lot of money for a lot of nothing. And so I was trying to think to myself of like, okay, though, like, it's just a hobby, right? So, like, you can spend $100 a month on any number of hobbies, and that wouldn't be weird, mm-hmm. right? I certainly spend plenty of money on good food, or, it wouldn't be that weird if you were spending, like, to talk about things that are more potentially, I guess, addictive than good food, perhaps. Like, it wouldn't be that unusual if you spent $100 a month on, like drinks, right? That especially in New York, that's like 6 drinks in a month with tip. And it wouldn't be that unusual if you spent $100 on, whatever, woodworking, bicycle stuff, right? And for some reason, if it's like virtual stuff, I just have a reaction to it of like, you've wasted your money. And like, why would you even, like, who cares about the 5-star character? Right? Like, it's not that much better than the other characters. And so I'll admit that I mean, I know. In some games. I have that reaction when looking at Genshin, for instance. Mm-hmm. I'm like, you can play the game. And I realize that, like, perhaps there's, like, a difficulty wall where you eventually need to grind a little bit. But it seems like the developers are pretty upfront about this. I think that, like, what they're doing is they're designing characters, or at first anyway, they were designing characters to appeal to, like, otakus like themselves. And the reason Genshin is doing better than their previous games is they've realized how to design characters that don't just appeal to those people a lot, but also are just, like, genuinely appealing characters. Mm-hmm. But it's also just, to me, like, okay, big deal. There are tons of characters. I don't think the stats are, like, so much better on the, Raider, Shogun, whatever. Maybe they are. And so, especially in those sorts of game situations where the game is good enough that I would actually find it something that's interesting to play, it's like, okay, big deal. I'm not, like, how could this possibly be your hobby? But I do sort of, I wonder to myself what feels like an amount that someone would be spending a month where I would feel justified in being judgmental, as opposed to having to really think to myself, no, it's a hobby. Do what brings you joy. Mm-hmm.
I mean, like anything, it's less, I think, about, like, how much money you're spending on it, and more, like, that you can't stop. Right?
Right.
It's not about, like, oh, I go out each weekend and I buy some expensive drinks, and maybe I shouldn't do that, but, like, whatever. It's so I do it for my hobby.
Right.
Uh, and so it's less about that and more like, oops, I accidentally spent $100 in a night. Right. It's about, I think, the intentionality of it versus feeling like you have to do it. And that's what defines addiction to something in the first place.
That makes sense. So then the elephant in the room, of course, is that nobody really cares about adults with addiction to these games, right? Screw them. Who cares?
Yeah.
Nobody cares. But I'm a government person, and I have to say, think of the children!
Yeah. Yeah, that's the US's main response to loot boxes so
main
far.
Response to games, to be honest. But go ahead.
Yeah. Is Josh Hawley of Missouri introduced a bill called, like, Protecting Children from Abusive Games Act. That sort of piggybacks off of COPPA, basically, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is the reason why, like, Facebook asks if you're over 13, for instance. And there would basically be fines for games that failed to like fall under the suggestions for games played by minors, if minors were found to be playing those games and buying loot boxes. It's a bipartisan bill. Ed Markey from Massachusetts supported it. And it sort of just sat there, and now it's expired now. So nothing came of it in the end.
I guess this was before the Biden presidency, but either way, imagine trying to explain to any president what this bill is that they're signing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because, of course, well, COPPA has perhaps good intentions. There are a lot of, like, well, it's hard to call them unintended when, of course, they probably were intended by some of the authors of the bill, right? But, like, it puts a lot of places in legal jeopardy for things that are, like, basically impossible, like you said in our notes, basically impossible to actually set up boundaries for, right? I think you are likely to still be able to get in trouble. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure that there's some way that you could still get in trouble if someone under 13 was using your site, even if they said they were 13, right? Now you've set up some degree of protection, but it's just a matter of, like, is that enough?
Yeah.
And similarly,
it's like when,
games, right?
like, the Steam page for every M-rated game is like, confirm your birthday, and I put in, like, January 1st, 1964.
Yeah, I put in, like, okay, what's the default old year you've put in? Great, I was born in 1902. Done.
Because that's there theoretically, like, discourage people from going there, but also it's so easy to ignore it. And that's sort of the case. I that feels like that would be the case for stuff like this too. Is your parent sets up an account and you play on it as a kid, which is not, like, that's not fundamentally bad either. It's just a matter of, like, supervision, basically. But it would be very hard for, like, a company to stop that sort of stuff from happening in the first place.
Absolutely. And it's tough, right? Because on one hand, it's shady to let the video game industry regulate itself when it's refused to admit that this is gambling, which it obviously is, time and time again. And it's only done the bare minimum when there's big outcry, like with Battlefront, and really only wants to regulate itself when capital G gamers come out and say, this is stopping my progression, this is pay to play, and review bomb stuff, right? That seems like a bad way to institute regulation in the industry. On the other hand, I don't want Josh Hawley deciding how games should be made.
Yeah.
So it's difficult because there's just not, as much as ESRB is now like trying to take up some tiny bit of that mantle by requiring that games list the presence of like loot boxes essentially in the ratings. Every time I see a post about that, like the first thing in the comments is, okay, but what happens to games that add loot boxes later on, right? And of course, maybe that updates in an online storefront, but like it doesn't update on the game that you bought. So it's challenging to think of like what is the effective system for this, other than people gaining a moral compass. That feels like a pretty rare pull.
Yeah. Yeah, the limits of self-regulation have basically been mostly what we've already talked about. Is probability disclosure is pretty much universally done now, is my understanding. I can see in Near Reincarnation when there's a banner, I can open up the probability for anything that can be pulled within that banner and look at it. There's Peggy and ESRB have new descriptors for when there's microtransactions, and then specifically when there's random item microtransactions. But we've talked before about like the limits of ESRB too in various areas. And some games have settings where you can like turn off or limit spending in some way. Although again, that in some like that's just a setting that you could turn off if you were addicted to it. You know, you might turn it on with good intentions and then be like, actually, no, I want to do this, and go into settings and turn it off.
I will say that plenty of the articles, and look, of course there are ways to get around this, right? But that plenty of the articles that I was reading around regulating this for children make the good and important point that like parental controls on phones for these sorts of games are just not at all adequate. And that if Apple and Android phones had stronger abilities or just more customizable abilities to prevent children from spending money in games, that would go a long way, at least toward avoiding that like most predatory of predatory stuff, right? Now, obviously, there are ways to get around that, right? You're on your parents' phone, you figure out the passcode, whatever, right? But that feels like it would save at least some of these stories of like, oh my god, my child spent $600 while I was cooking dinner, kind of things that always get all the press around this.
I mean, it's also just the thing of like, children don't necessarily have a conception of like spending $600 while you're cooking dinner, like what that means exactly.
And
you know, because they're children. It's not their responsibility, right?
That's my critique of the percentages thing too, even for adults. Like of course a 5-year-old is not going to understand what it means to have a 5% chance of pulling Donald Duck or whatever, right?
Wow, I think Donald Duck would definitely be like at least like a 1% chance.
Isn't he pretty common in some?
I don't know.
Whatever.
I'm just saying, you're disrespecting Donald Duck.
I'm sorry, Donald Duck. I was trying to pick a low percentage that wasn't too exploitative. I'm doing my best here. But like even me playing it, right? Like I might not have a clear perspective on how rare that is, right? We're pretty bad at understanding orders of magnitude as humans. See what it means to be a billionaire versus a millionaire.
Yeah.
And so I do wonder, like, on some level, like, it's good. More transparency is definitely good, but I do wonder how far that really goes toward combating addictive or, like, semi-addictive type behavior, because it just feels like if you're in that boat and you're susceptible to that kind of thing, that those numbers are not going to dissuade you, right? That's the whole idea of casinos, right? You just have to get lucky once. You just have to get lucky once.
Tax on people who are bad at math.
For real. No, seriously, though.
Yep.
Um,
But it's not going away.
Nope.
Genshin is, like, absurdly successful. So it is certainly not going away.
I mean, in some ways, Genshin is a case study for a slightly better way of doing this, right? Like,
well, there's ups and downs to Genshin, for sure.
Sure. But they do
their pull rate is, like, noticeably lower than a lot of other games. So there is that.
For sure. I don't mean to say that the gacha, like, if you dive into their specific gacha, that it's less predatory, because I think it's not.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that relative to games that I was reading at, they're a lot less pushy about it. Now, of course, I mean, if you're playing the game, you're going to know about it, right? But they're a lot less pushy about it. It blocks your progress in ways that are less meaningful than in some other games. And, of course, and whatever, right? This is definitely perhaps my Western sensibilities talking, but it's just a better game, apart from the gacha pulls, than a lot of these mobile titles.
Well, I think that's why it is so successful, is because it is a game.
Yeah.
Like, it's a full-fledged RPG that's not even, like, it's got, like, 2 of, like, planned, like, 9 world zones opened. So it's, like, a huge, full RPG with lots of things to do. So theoretically, even if you're stuck, there's lots of stuff you can continue to do in the game. Although I did see a bunch of stuff where it's like you eventually get to the point where you're kind of blocked on a lot of stuff. Yeah.
I would be curious to find out. So Genshin is free to play.
Yeah. Right?
Which I think in many ways insulates it from a lot of the critiques that Western loot box games receive.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think justifiably excludes it from some of those critiques, right? Like the Battlefield 2 stuff, it's just like, yeah, you paid $60 for this game, and now you have to pay more to progress. Look, games are underpriced, right? Of course. $60 is not really the right price for a game anymore, but that's a shady
especially
way to do
live
it.
Service games. Where you might buy for $60, but then there's like seasons of content after that you're not paying for instance.
Exactly. So I won't say, of course, that companies don't need to find ways to make money. We live in a capitalist society. They're companies. It's their job to make money. But Genshin, I think, does deflect some criticism by saying, well, you can play it for free.
Mm-hmm.
And so something I would be curious about is, okay, so let's say you hit that kind of content slowdown. I was seeing some stuff say, like, about 20 hours in, you run out of, like, things just slow down, right?
Yeah.
Okay, number one, 20 hours of, like, a pretty good RPG for free, that already is pretty high value. But what I would be curious about is, okay, how much does $60 of gacha pulls get me? Does it get me enough that I can continue the game? Look, maybe it doesn't get me the super shiny character, right? But I would be curious. Right? Do I just hit a paywall where I have to move from the free version to the paid version? If so, maybe that's justifiable, right? Now, of course, that's not the business model, but I would be curious. I'd be curious of how serious is that paywall? Is it just that you don't want to pay anything for this game? Because, okay, sure, but that's probably unreasonable given the amount of content that they're... Like, I understand there being a point where it's like, okay, I have to pay $10 to get the full game.
Yeah.
Anyway, my point being, of course, it's gacha, there's still predatory stuff going here, but I think you made the interesting point early in the episode that gacha is almost a genre, and in Genshin, I mean, as someone who's only played a little bit of it, right, it seems more like a mechanic rather than really the genre of the game. And that makes it feel less offensive to me, for better or for worse.
Yeah. I mean, I do think perhaps this all just comes back to there just needs to be better support systems for these kinds of addictions, because you can make the most well-intentioned gacha in the world, and someone's still going to be getting those dopamines and will be blowing their life savings on it. Because it's a thing that does that, right? It just is a system that gives you the dopamines.
Well, it's challenging,
and there's
right?
nothing you can do for that when working within it. So I think that probably the most ideal solution is to create more comprehensive systems for dealing with these kinds of addictions.
A societal solution. Emma, we only had an hour to talk about this. No, I think the major challenge comes from, like, those whales are the consistent way to make your money, right? And not all of the whales, by whales I mean people who are big spenders in these games, are spending in ways that are necessarily unhealthy, right? If I'm just a rich dude and I want to pour all of my money into getting my preferred, like, anime waifu for Genshin Impact, I suppose that's my business, right? Mm-hmm. And, like, that's okay. But, of course, the challenge is, like, that's the way you make the money on the game, by having people spend more and more and more. And if you institute caps on that would help people play safer, you, one, limit your profits, and two, you would probably get a lot of backlash from people who are like, I'm an adult! Stop treating me like a second grader! I can make my own decisions! So you really can't win.
Yeah. I did read some interesting stuff. I was reading a little bit about, like, why is gambling addicted in Scientific American. And they're talking about how, having a gambling addict in the long term is not actually profitable for a casino, because they start racking up things that they cannot actually pay. And so, like, one thing they do is, like, just stick a bunch of, like, gambling pamphlets, like, by ATMs and payphones, for instance, and just or they have training to keep an eye out for people who are maybe spending a little bit more than they should be in a night, because in the long run it's not, like, maybe in the short run it's good to have them, but in the long run it's not actually good for the casino in any noticeable way. It's just a hassle. But I don't think there's quite the same problem with Gacha, which, again, doesn't really encourage developers to, like, be like, hey, you okay, but...
Well, you'd think part of the incentive for the casino, perhaps not all of it, certainly not the majority, I mean, not all of it, certainly not the majority of it either, probably, is that, like, it's not great to have somebody who ultimately has a meltdown or something in the casino, right?
Yeah.
Whereas with Gacha, if you have a meltdown that you just accidentally spent $2,000 and you're not going to be able to pay rent, nobody else playing the game has to look at you.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure that's not the majority of it. I'm sure that not actually being able to pay and taking up seats and using the casino services is more significant than that. But I do think that's a significant factor in why Gacha is able to kind of, like, just don't have to pay as much attention to it, because it doesn't affect any other player. And also, frankly, there's just not the societal sympathy for it, right? Like, there's at least some level of sympathy for gambling addiction. Perhaps not a lot, but some. I do feel like with Gacha, a lot of or just with online gambling, there's a lot more of a tendency to get a response that's like, well, just stop. Like, turn off the game. Just don't do it.
Yeah.
You're an adult. Don't make that choice. And it's just not taken as seriously.
Yeah.
Or it gets swept in with the idea of, like, games addiction in general, which, of course, is sort of a politicized topic and often deployed in ways that aren't genuine.
Yeah.
And so you then kind of get the backlash to the backlash of, like, oh, but, like, games addiction isn't really real the way that people talk about it being, and so, like, it can't be real here also, even though this is very much gambling and not gaming.
Yeah, and the thing with, like, game addiction is, again, like, that can be anything. you know, anything that makes your dopamines light up a lot, and if you get too far into it to the point where it's damaging your life, then yeah, that's an addiction, right? It's just, I think people get defensive about gaming addiction because it makes it sound like it's like some unique factor of a video game that like it hurts you in some way, as well as getting wrapped up with like all the other bad faith accusations that come up in certain times, such as violence and that sort of stuff. But like, you know, you can get addicted to anything that causes that chemical response in you.
It's just, how do you get games to put like Surgeon General warnings on them, right? Like, I don't know enough about how it became the case that the tobacco industry had to basically scream that cigarettes are bad everywhere and not really be able to advertise and that sort of thing. And not to say that that's even necessarily appropriate for things like this, because of course cigarettes are sort of unequivocally bad for you, and maybe Gacha is a mixed bag. But
Gacha probably doesn't give you cancer. Unless your phone is giving you cancer. Who knows?
In which case, it's really just too late.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just like, is that the kind of labeling we need? But on the other hand, oh my god, please don't let the government do that. They don't know what they're talking about and they will do it wrong.
Yeah.
So it's just this horrible balance of the industry really can't regulate itself because it wants to make money, and it will never, this is like the way to make money, right? This is like, microtransactions are the future of games. And, you know, they're not going to take that away from themselves unless somebody tells them to. But the person who would tell them to also has never played a video game and never will.
Yeah.
So it's just like this like rock in a hard place thing.
I don't know. Maybe a few more like uproars in Congress where nothing actually happens might scare the video games industry into doing something. That's sort of how all self-regulation in the industry has come about so far. So,
I mean, I think where it'll come from is like China will ban them eventually, and then it will be such a it will be enough of a hassle to have to like remake your game for a huge audience in China that they'll fade away somewhere else. But I think it'll be like pressure from foreign markets that gets loot boxes gone, or just some kind of high profile thing in Japan. The Japanese government, well, I don't know. It's a huge revenue driver. So on one hand, they don't want to destroy that whole industry. But on the other hand, population growth is slow, and the children need to get out of the house.
Don't play Gacha. Play the baby Gacha. Please have babies.
There was a name for it in reverse, too, right? So if you're a kid, you played Oya Gacha, where it was like your parents. But there, I did see in the article, it's like there's the reverse thing where you're the parent, and then like your baby is the gacha. So can't ban it because it's just the way of life. Well, anything else to say on gacha games?
I think we did a pretty good primer overall.
Well, stay tuned in 2 weeks for Emma to report in on more Near Reincarnation and how that gameplay experience is.
You know, I'll talk about it a little bit. It's interesting because I do feel like I've sort of hit a wall on progress, but not in a way where, like, spending my diamonds would help me at all. Which diamonds are the premium currency of the game that you would spend real money to get. And so far as that, there have been a few bundles that have items in them too, but the main thing you buy is diamonds. And yeah, I guess you can use them as like stamina refills in the same way as you have stamina potions, but oh my god, I have like 5,000 stamina potions from like just the beginning like offer. Like, if I could play this game all day and I would still have way too many stamina potions. And so the other thing is just pulling the gacha, but like even if I got better characters, I need to then level up those characters so that they're more powerful. And that's where I'm hitting the wall. But like if spending money doesn't help me through that at all. It doesn't get me like more of the soft currency, which is the non-viable one. I can't get more of that by spending money. And that's what I'm low on. So, like, even if I wanted to, like, move faster, I don't think spending money would actually do me very much good at this point, interestingly enough. So, that's my take on Near Reincarnation so far.
Right? Does Square develop this one, or is it a sub-company?
Square publishes it, I believe. So they did list it in their, like, revenue making. It's making them a decent amount of money, but it's Applebot, I think, is the developer on this.
Well, Applebot, Square, whoever makes these decisions, Emma is telling you that she does not have enough ways to spend money in the game.
No,
so
that's
you're
not
missing out on revenue from her.
That's not what I'm saying.
Give her more things to buy, and perhaps she will give you money.
No.
Well. Well, listeners, have you ever played a gacha game? Have you found the one that really gets you tempted to spend all the way up to your credit limit to get that one character? Have you played physical gacha, and do you find that as rewarding or more rewarding than virtual pulls? Are you still playing
the gashapon sound, you know?
Square, are you listening? Emma wants the gashapon sound when she pulls characters in
I do.
Near Reincarnation.
It does have a fun effect when you pull a 4-star character where, like, the loading screen, like, glitches out and you get, like, a special, like, text blurb about it, and then it shows you the character. It's good. It's fun. It makes the little happy guys in my brain go, woo! So...
Listeners, what's the little happy guys in your brain love? If you have answers to any of those questions, or just want to say hello, find us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also follow our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games that are in the hat, our own version of a gacha poll for our main episodes.
Yeah.
And you can read our blog featuring long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend and Split Screen, where we just finished up My Hero Academia and Coffee Prince. And now we're starting Crash Landing on You and more My Hero Academia.
Yeah.
Maybe this time around we'll finish season 5 before season 6. Who knows?
Hopefully. Next time we're talking about Alan Wake and Cloudpunk.
Alan Wake has been all over my socials lately.
The remastered is out now.
So it's good timing.
Yeah, I bought it. I'll have played some of it this time.
Wow.
Won't just be Madeline being cool and hip on her research.
Who would have thought? Emma, cool and hip.
That's me.
Anyway, if you think one or both of us are even a little cool and hip and you don't want to miss a show, the best way you can do that is to subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Cast, anywhere that you can find podcasts, you can find Talk This. So as Emma said, next week, main edition. Week after that, it's time for our 6 weeks in gaming. You'll get to hear all that we've been playing for the past 6 weeks. So good stuff coming up as we head into October.
Yeah. Do you want to sign us off?
Yeah, folks, thanks for listening today. I hope that if this week doesn't go well for you, that you get a chance at a reroll.